All right, I want to welcome everyone here tonight for the Mennonite Voice Call. It's our February call. We are going to talk a little bit about topics like what were Russians doing in the Chaco during the 1930s, and then also to bring the conclusion to the story of the boys who got in trouble in village number 1. But to start out with, I would like to just answer any questions, um, anyone that wants to maybe share a story, you can feel free to pop in and do that now. I know one of the questions we had that were asked is what year are they when is Paraguay or when is Philadelphia celebrating their centennial celebration, and that is happening in 5 years. So if any of you are planning to go see a big celebration, that's going to happen in 2029. So I guess it's 4 years from now. And I believe they may celebrate it 2030 just because that, there were a lot that came in 30. It was kind of a spread out between 2000 or 1929 and 1930. So I believe they told me it's going to be in 5 years. So get ourselves ready for that celebration. Now, the colony Meno arrived there 3 years earlier, so they will be celebrating theirs earlier. That's more like in 2027. So, and Meno, yes, is still the biggest colony. It is much bigger than Fadenheim. In fact, Fadenheim one of the big things they just did is they shut down their milk factory. So where they had been producing cheese and yogurt and all kinds of cultured drinks, pasteurized milk, long shelf milk, yes, they shut it down so that it just was not paying for itself anymore. And so the milk now is being sold to Menno, and Menno is buying it off of Philadelphia or Fadenheim's farmers, for those who are still dairy farmers. And that just learning to consolidate and really working more together as colonies, I think, is becoming a bigger need and a big push. So that's a little update on that. But then next week, I invite you to join next month, the fourth Monday of March. You're welcome to join me again for talking about the differences of the different colonies of Menno, Neuland, and Fadenheim. So yeah, there are distinct differences, even culturally somewhat. There is still some differences between the different people, which is very intriguing to me, and maybe it is to you. And if it is, then join me on that call. And also submit any further questions you might have, even after listening to this call or this recording. Make sure you submit questions and we'll try to get those answered as soon as we can. All right, moving on to the next part. And that is, what were Russians doing in the Chaco in the 1930s? So there are several incidences in the stories I've been reading where people encountered Russians. Now, the picture here on the slide shows the Puerto Casado, so the original building, even a well that has been refurbished, the cobblestone laid on the porch, the wires above used to be a vineyard that was growing, and it would be the shade for the little patio area. And this is where the train stopped that brought the Mennonites from the river, from the ship, into the Chaco for about 145 kilometers. Now, they still had a long way to go to get to where they wanted to go, where they were assigned to live in more the central part of the Chaco. But from here, then they would have to get on ox carts and travel for another, sometimes 5 to 7 days to the next location. The man who built this station, his name was Carlos Casado, and he was in charge. He had been given the management piece of the Chaco. And something that I just recently learned as I visited this on my last trip was that the Chaco had been given kind of as to pay off war debt. Argentina had their hands on this for a certain time period. So it was a little bit of a contested piece of land between Paraguay and Bolivia. And when it came down to Bolivia starting to bomb Paraguay, in fact, they actually at one point bombed this little station. And as soon as the Argentinian president heard about it, he said, if you continue, watch out. We're going to make sure this stays in Paraguayan hands. So all that to say, the Argentinians were in this area, kind of harvesting doing some forestry, not a whole lot going on. They had some cattle ranches. But again, this was a very rough place to live. Not too many people wanted to live there. The nickname it was the Green Hell because it was just super hard to even function in the Chaco due to the extreme heat, the lack of rain, and freshwater sources. So, where do the Russians come in? Well, after the First World War, 1915, Russia was split. There were three different parties, I would say, or three different groups fighting in Russia, and the White Army was the one who lost. And so many of those soldiers fled and moved to Argentina. When the Mennonites arrived in the Chaco, it was on brink of the Chaco War between Paraguay and Bolivia. They were getting ready to fight. The Mennonites didn't realize it, but they were settled right in the middle of it. So 1929, 1930, they're finally getting settled in. About 3 years later, a war starts out. And most of the fighting happened around the colonies, but the stations, the hospitals, the different military zones for the Paraguayans were set up around the Mennonite colonies. And that's where the Argentinians brought in Russian commanders who had been trained in the Russian army, who were professionals at war. They were assigned and hired for this war, and they were in these positions. And so one of the stories talks about a Russian meeting up with another Mennonite at the well getting water. And while they're talking, the Russian was able to communicate with this Mennonite because most of the Mennonites, at least the ones from Fattenheim, spoke fluent Russian still. And so here he's talking about how he was comparing the war against Paraguay, he was comparing the war that they fought in the First World War and how the soldiers had all been well trained and they lost the war. This war, the Paraguayans were fighting barefoot and they were winning the war. And it just got the Mennonites thinking that God was looking out for them. God was protecting them. And that was one of the encounters. The other encounter that happened was from the story, Darp Eint, that Wilmar Stahl just recently published, that he tells of a story where Mr. Ron meets gets connected with a Russian commander who is stationed just outside the village. And this Russian commander gives him a cow with the condition that he would bring him milk every day. So Mr. Ron, on a daily basis, walk over to the military station, which was probably like a 15 minute to half an hour walk. And he goes there, gives the milk. A little bit of an exchange happens where he also gives Mr. Ron some extra food, different provisions in exchange for the milk. And this happens on a daily basis. One day, Mr. Ron's dog goes along, and as he's coming onto the premise of this military station, everything's pretty busy, and this one truck ends up hitting and killing the dog. And, it was sad. It was kind of an unfortunate situation, but it was not really anybody's fault. It was just they didn't expect a dog to be running right in front of them. So he gives the milk, he goes home, he's like, there's nothing I can do other than just bury the dog here. Well, the commander hears about it, and the soldier that ended up killing the dog with the truck ends up getting punished. So the next day when Mr. Ron comes and brings the milk, he sees the guy bound up, or I don't know, like put in like they used the hollow wood of the bottle tree as like a place for storage, or even sometimes it was to sheet kind of a lookout to spot the enemy. Well, this soldier was kind of confined to this hollow bottle tree as a punishment. And that really upset Mr. Ron. And so he went directly to the commander and spoke Russian with him and asked him to not be so harsh with the soldier. And so the commander actually respected that and let the soldier go. And that later on, years later, like I think it was almost 30 years down the road, he meets up with this soldier again, and they just give each other a big hug. And so really sweet encounters. Now these Russians were not the Red Party Russians that Stalin party was. These were white Russians who actually were trying to bring in who lost to communism. So I don't know if they were bringing in a democracy or what, but they lost to the Communist Party, and so they had to leave. And their war expertise was used in the Chaco War. So very interesting. Out in the middle of nowhere, the Mennonites come together and they have a common motherland, Russia, that both people have lost due to the political overthrow. All right, the next part of today's talk that I wanted to mention is the final conclusion of the story of Village Number 1, where a group of guys had done a horrible prank to this girl who came driving home in her buggy at night with her horses, and they had pretended like they were, and everyone was very cautious about being out at dark due to some of the encounters they had with some of the primitive people in the bush. And when they put mud on their faces and stopped the horses, she was in such shock. Now, he didn't go into detail as to her screaming, but they knew that he just explained or described her as being very scared. And the guys were in trouble because everyone in the community said, this is not okay. We don't do this kind of a prank on girls. And they were going around trying to figure out who the culprits were. Well, when the guys knew it was getting close to them being found out, they knew it would be better for them to plead for mercy than to be found out and punished, because the punishments that were given were not fun. So they plead for mercy. And again, this is very shame honor culture. You plead for mercy, maybe not in public, but you find someone that you can trust in. And so they find a Mr. Cosper, who they knew they could confide in, and told him the story and told him how sorry they had done that. They would never do it again. And when the next meeting they had as a community in the village, Mr. Cosper just came out and said, everything has been, that means it's been taken care of. We can close this chapter. We don't need to continue finding out who the culprits were. So, yes, there were times where pretty serious punishments were given for people that were going against community standards, but very often a plead for mercy and asking for forgiveness was granted in many cases. So that's all for tonight. if you are interested in learning more about the differences between the different colonies, that's coming up in a month. So join me for that call, and I look forward to seeing you here. Have a good evening.